the life and legacy of my mother, Kwailan, and what a long and illustrious life it was. You could say enough to fill 2 lifetimes. Her father was James Yuwoon, Chinese immigrant who hailed from Guangdong province. Her mother was Josephine Albert. She hailed from the little village of San Rafael. My mother was the second of 6 children, 3 girls and 3 boys, and her 2 brothers are here remaining. She was born and raised in Belmont, and she grew up selling in her father's shop. That would have been just opposite Pickett's Corner in Belmont. After, she went to Holy Name, or during, and she's also studied in later life French and Spanish. She had a gift for languages, which would come in useful later on our sailing voyages. So my father was also from Belmont, and this is where they met when they were youngsters. In their 20s, he started sailing. He built his own dinghies, and he invited her, and they would go sailing off the shores of Cocorit in the 1950s, where they made lifelong friends. People like Jose Mosca, Roel Barrow, Eugene Achong, and Mervyn Williams. Then a few years later, while Mom was working in Maracaibo in Venezuela for Dominion Oil, my father started building a 26-foot yacht, a little boat called Hummingbird, in which he had plans to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. So at this point, my mother had to decide what life she wanted. To go off with this crazy guy sailing across oceans, or lead a normal life here on land. And of course, she chose the former, and she said yes. They got married, and in 1960, they set off across the Atlantic with their best friend, Buck Wong Chong, Kelvin. Of course, everyone said they were crazy, and they were going to die at sea. It was a tiny little boat with no engine, no sink, no toilet, just use a bucket and a small kerosene stove. So off they went via Antigua and then the Azores, and several weeks later they landed in England. So they became the first Trinidadians, the first West Indians to sail across the Atlantic in their own vessel. In England, they sold the little Hummingbird and went to work in Nigeria for a few months, teaching leadership and adventure courses. On returning home, my father, he had great ambitions, and he started building the 40-foot Hummingbird 2. I had, by this time, been born, and again, my mother stood by her husband and said she would sail with him. And so we set off in 1969. On the ocean, my mother became my teacher. English, arithmetic, geography. But she wasn't just a teacher. She was first mate, cook, assistant navigator, because in those days, of course, there was no GPS. We had to use the sextant. That voyage turned out to be successful. We left here in 1984, came back 2¼ years later in 1986. In 1987, my mother had a desire to go and seek out her Chinese heritage, where her father had originated. So she went to China, to the place where he had come from, and she met her cousins and her family. And she also stayed there for 6 months, where she taught English at the Sun Yat-sen Middle School in Zhongshan. There was one more voyage for Mom. She said this would be her last long-distance voyage, and that was in 1992 when she, my father, and some young crew members sailed to Spain, and then she made the return trip back home. It was on this voyage, they carried the Trinidad and Tobago flag to the Barcelona Olympics, where that particular flag was used in the opening ceremony by our local Trinidad and Tobago team. My parents were always proud Trinbagonians. We flew our flag proudly everywhere. And Mom never stopped promoting this land, Trinidad and Tobago, wherever we went. For all these voyages, and for the small business Hummingbird Marina that we opened in Chagaramas in 1994, my mother was the driving force behind it all. She did the logistics, the finance, correspondence. She worked tirelessly, writing letters, making phone calls, editing my father's books. She scrimped and saved and invested to finance all our voyages and the small business. I was recently reminded by a friend that someone who knew my parents well long ago once said, "Harold had the vision, but Kwailan made it happen." She had an iron will, indomitable spirit, and the perseverance of Job. She was the bravest woman I've ever known. She was our rock, but more than that, she was a star. In my father's film, he made a film about our first circumnavigation. That film was called All Oceans Blue. And in it, there's a song called You'll Never Get By Without a Star. And that star was my mother. So if you go outside tonight and you look up in the night sky and you see a little star twinkling there brightly that you probably never saw before, that's my mother. That's Kwailan La Borde.